My name is Jonathan Hale. I'm in my late 30s now, and for a long time I lived a life that looked solid from the outside. Respectable, predictable, the kind of life people point to when they talk about stability. I was a husband, a professional, someone who showed up on time, paid his share, kept his promises, and didn't make noise unless it was necessary. To most people, that made me easy to understand and easy to underestimate. If you'd asked others how they saw me back then, they would have said I was fortunate. Fortunate to marry into a family with connections. Fortunate to have access, comfort, and a future that seemed secure. Some might have said I was reserved, maybe even passive. Not weak, just quiet. What they didn't see was that quiet doesn't mean unaware. It doesn't mean compliant, and it certainly doesn't mean blind. I've always been observant. I listen carefully. I notice what people say when they think they're being generous, and what they assume when they think you won't object. I remember tone more than words, patterns more than promises. That tendency served me well in work. But inside my marriage, it slowly turned into something else. My calm became convenient. My reliability became an expectation. And over time, my role stopped being negotiated and started being assumed. This story isn't about rage or dramatic confrontation. There's no sudden betrayal scene, no explosive argument that ends everything in one night. What happened instead was far more subtle and far more unsettling. It's the story of a marriage that looked like love on the surface, but underneath operated like a transaction. A long-term arrangement where money, status, and family advantage mattered more than mutual choice, where affection existed, but only as long as it supported the structure. I didn't realize it all at once. No one ever does. It starts with moments so small they're easy to dismiss, comments that don't sit right, decisions made without your input, gratitude that feels conditional. Over time, those moments stack up, quietly forming a shape you can no longer ignore. Eventually, I understood something that changed how I saw everything. I wasn't the partner they protected. I was the asset they managed. This story follows that realization from the years when I didn't yet have the language for what felt wrong, to the moment clarity arrived without drama, without anger, and without any need to raise my voice. I'm not telling this to paint myself as flawless or anyone else as cruel. I stayed longer than I should have. I rationalized things that deserve scrutiny. I mistook endurance for maturity and silence for peace. I'm telling it because there's a particular kind of betrayal that doesn't come from hatred, but from calculation. And it leaves marks that only become visible when you step far enough away to see the whole picture. So before we go any further, let me ask you one gentle question, one you don't have to answer out loud. Have you ever realized too late that someone didn't love you? They loved what you made possible? For a long time, I believed I knew exactly who I was in that family. I was the steady one. Not the most charismatic, not the loudest voice in the room, but the one people relied on when things needed to be handled without drama. I paid attention to details others overlooked. I remembered deadlines, names, and preferences. I followed through. In the early days of my marriage, that reliability was framed as a virtue. My wife would smile and say, Jonathan's the grounding force. Her parents described me as solid. Friends joked that I was the adult in the group, even when everyone was the same age. It all sounded flattering enough, at least on the surface. But underneath those compliments was something else, something quieter. I was never the center of conversations. I wasn't asked for opinions on major decisions unless they directly involved logistics or execution. When plans were made, I was informed, not consulted. At first, I told myself this was normal. Different families have different dynamics. Some people lead, others support. Someone has to be the calm one. I noticed that when her family talked about success, they spoke in terms of visibility, titles, social reach, whose name opened doors. And when they spoke about me, it was always in terms of function. Jonathan handles things. Jonathan is good with numbers. Jonathan doesn't make things complicated. No one ever said Jonathan inspires, or Jonathan is deeply loved, or Jonathan is irreplaceable, and yet I was always there. At dinners, I poured the wine while conversations continued around me. At gatherings, I was the one asked to pick someone up from the airport or quickly look over a document. When a minor crisis appeared, all eyes shifted toward me, not with concern, but with expectation. I didn't resent it at the time. I mistook being needed for being valued. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't feel like rejection. It feels useful. And because you're included, because you're trusted with responsibility, you don't realize how little emotional space you actually occupy. My wife rarely spoke about me when I wasn't present. I noticed that later. When she talked about her parents, her siblings, and even her friends, she described them with stories, traits, and quirks. With me, it was always summaries. He's stable. He's good at managing things. He supports what I do. Support. That word followed me everywhere. I supported her career decisions. I supported family obligations. I supported relocations that benefited her network more than mine. Each time it was framed as what makes sense for us. But us always seemed to lean in one direction. When her parents introduced me to others, they rarely mentioned my background or ambitions. Instead, they highlighted how I fit. He's perfect for her, very dependable. He keeps everything running smoothly. It wasn't cruel. That's important to say. There was no open hostility, no obvious disrespect. That's why it took so long to see. I wasn't being pushed down. I was being placed. There's a difference. I began to realize that no one was curious about my inner life. My doubts, my long-term goals, even my exhaustion. Those things didn't disrupt the system, so they didn't require attention. When I spoke less, no one asked why. When I deferred, it was taken as an agreement. When I compromised, it was absorbed into the expectation that I always would. And Sakan and I allowed it because it felt easier than questioning the entire structure. I told myself this was what adulthood looked like, that love matured into efficiency. Those roles were natural, not assigned. But deep down, something unsettled me. I felt known for my output, not my presence. Respected for my stability, not chosen for my individuality. And once that awareness surfaced, even faintly, it became impossible to unfeel. I didn't yet know what it meant. I didn't yet know where it would lead. I only knew this. In their story, I wasn't the protagonist. I was infrastructure, useful, reliable, invisible. And at the time, I still believed that was enough. The first moment I remember didn't feel significant at the time. That's what makes it dangerous in hindsight. Small things slip past your defenses because they don't announce themselves as threats. We were at a family dinner, nothing formal, just one of those evenings where conversation flows easily and no one expects tension. Her parents were discussing an upcoming investment opportunity, real estate, something tied to a friend of the family. I listened quietly, as I usually did. Numbers have always come naturally to me, and as they talked, I noticed inconsistencies, optimistic projections, costs that hadn't been accounted for, risks no one was naming. When there was a pause, I spoke up, not forcefully, not arrogantly, just enough to ask a clarifying question. Have you accounted for the maintenance overhead long term? I asked. Because if interest rates shift, the margins might tighten faster than expected. The table went quiet for half a second. Then her father smiled, a polite smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Oh, Jonathan," he said lightly, waving his hand, "this is more of a big picture play. The details tend to work themselves out." A few people chuckled. The conversation moved on. No one looked back at me. No one asked a follow-up. My question dissolved into the air as if it had never been spoken. I remember nodding, smiling. I took a sip of my drink. On the outside, I let it go immediately. On the inside, something registered. It wasn't that I'd been wrong. I knew the numbers well enough to be confident in the concern. It wasn't even that they disagreed. That happens. It was the tone. The assumption is embedded in the dismissal. "This isn't your arena. You don't need to worry about this. Your role is elsewhere." Later that night, as we drove home, I mentioned it casually to my wife. I said I thought the investment carried more risk than they were acknowledging. She didn't argue. She didn't ask me to explain. She just said, "They've been doing this kind of thing for a long time. They know how it works." That was it. "No, we'll think about it." Not, "You might be right." Just a quiet closing of the door. I told myself I was overreacting. Families have hierarchies. Experience matters. Not every thought needs to be entertained. But over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. A decision about a holiday trip where my schedule wasn't considered. A financial conversation where I was asked to handle the paperwork after the plan was already set. A comment from her mother said kindly about how I was so good at supporting from behind the scenes. Each moment was small, harmless even. And because no one else reacted, I questioned my own perception. That's how these cuts work. They don't bleed right away, they bruise. They leave tenderness you only notice when you press on it later. I remember thinking, if this really mattered, I'd feel angrier. But I didn't feel anger. I felt reduced. Not insulted, not attacked, just slightly repositioned. Everyone else moved on as if nothing had happened. And because I didn't want to disrupt the peace over something minor, I did too. I told myself, choose your battles. Don't be sensitive. This isn't about you. But the thing about the first small cut is this. You remember it, not because it hurts the most, but because it's the moment you realize you can be hurt without anyone noticing. And once that door opens, even a little, it never fully closes again. After the first few moments, I started doing what most reasonable people do when something feels off but not catastrophic. I rationalized. I told myself that no family operates perfectly, that I was reading too much into tone, into phrasing, into small omissions that didn't deserve the weight I was giving them. I reminded myself that my wife loved me, that we had built a life together, that harmony mattered more than being right. And so, when similar situations repeated themselves, I adjusted quietly. When conversations drifted into areas where my input might complicate things, I stayed silent. When decisions were presented as conclusions rather than discussions, I nodded. When someone interrupted me mid-sentence, I let them finish and didn't circle back. I became efficient at minimizing my own friction. At first, it felt like maturity, the kind people praise in hindsight, but over time, I noticed a pattern emerging, one I didn't consciously choose but slowly inhabited. Disrespect, when it arrives softly enough, can be mistaken for normalcy. There were gatherings where my wife's relatives discussed plans that directly affected our finances before I even knew they were being considered. When I asked questions later, the answers were brief, almost rehearsed. It's already handled. It makes sense for the family. We didn't think you'd mind. That last one lingered. We didn't think you'd mind. We forgot to ask. We should have included you. Just the assumption that my consent was guaranteed. And I made it true by not objecting. I told myself that my calmness was a strength, that being easygoing kept things smooth, that pushing back over every slight would make me look insecure. So instead, I adapted. I took on more responsibility quietly. I handled logistics. I solved problems before they became visible. I absorbed stress so others didn't have to feel it. And in doing so, I trained them. People learn how to treat you by watching what you tolerate. The more dependable I became, the less they checked in. The less I spoke, the more they filled the space with their own assumptions. My silence was interpreted as alignment. My flexibility is permission. What troubled me most wasn't any single incident. It was the cumulative effect. I started noticing how rarely anyone asked what I wanted. Not just about big life decisions, but small ones. Where I preferred to spend holidays, what I thought about long-term plans, whether I was tired. I became the background constant, the person you rely on without thinking to thank. And because I didn't protest, no one felt the need to justify it. My wife, too, began to treat my agreement as automatic. Not maliciously, not consciously, just as something she could count on. When she talked about future plans, she said, "we," but the details were already formed. When I hesitated, she reassured me it would all work out, without asking what part of it concerned me. I started to feel like I was living in a life designed by committee, where my role was to execute, not contribute. Still, I stayed, because leaving or even challenging the structure felt disproportionate to the evidence I had. There was no dramatic wrongdoing to point to, no clear line had been crossed, just a slow erosion of presence. And I told myself that if I was patient enough, visible enough through action, eventually I would be seen. That was the quiet lie I believed the longest. Because what I didn't understand yet was this. Once people get used to benefiting from your silence, your voice becomes inconvenient. And by the time you notice, the disrespect no longer feels like an exception. It feels like the rules. It took me a long time to realize that no one sat down and decided who I would be in that family. Roles like mine aren't announced, they're assumed. They emerge quietly, shaped by repetition and reinforced by convenience. And once everyone benefits from them, no one has an incentive to question them, except the person living inside the role. I was the reliable one, the fixer, the buffer. If there was tension, I smoothed it over. If there was a gap, I filled it. If something needed follow-up, it became mine by default. I wasn't asked anymore. I was expected. The language around me shifted subtly. Instead of, "Could you help with this?" it became, "You'll handle this, right?" Instead of, "What do you think?" it became, "This is what we're doing." And the more I complied without resistance, the more permanent the role became. What struck me later was how little room there was for me to change without causing discomfort. The few times I hesitated, when I asked for time to think or expressed uncertainty, there was a visible pause, a recalibration, as if the system didn't know how to process that input. My wife would reassure others on my behalf. "He's fine with it. He doesn't mind. He's just being cautious." Cautious. That word did a lot of work. It framed my concerns as personality quirks rather than valid objections. It translated my boundaries into temporary moods. And I let it happen because correcting it felt exhausting. I began to understand something uncomfortable. I wasn't just being overlooked. I was being used strategically, not in a malicious way, but in an efficient one. My financial stability made certain risks acceptable. My calm demeanor made conflict easier to avoid. My willingness to stay behind the scenes allowed others to move faster and louder. I was the foundation that no one decorated. The role extended beyond logistics. Emotionally, I became the place where expectations landed but rarely returned. I listened, I supported, I absorbed stress. But when I needed reassurance, when I needed to feel chosen rather than relied upon, the response was vague. "You know we appreciate you. You're so steady. That's just how families work." Appreciation without attention, praise without intimacy. There was a moment, small but revealing, when I saw the role clearly for the first time. We were discussing a potential move, one that would benefit her family's network significantly. I asked how it would affect my career trajectory. The room went quiet again. Not awkward, just dismissive. Her mother said gently, "Jonathan, you're adaptable. That's one of your strengths." Adaptable. Not ambitious, not valued. Adaptable. It was said as a compliment, but it landed like a label. That was the moment I understood. My flexibility had become an asset to others, not to me. I wasn't expected to grow in a way that disrupted the system. I was expected to bend. And bending over time becomes your shape. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. Because part of me still believed that if I performed the role perfectly, if I was indispensable enough, eventually I would be treated as irreplaceable. That belief kept me compliant longer than I cared to admit. But something had shifted. I no longer saw my position as neutral. I saw it as assigned. And once you recognize the role others have written for you, you face a quiet, unavoidable question. Do you continue playing it? Or do you step out of the script entirely? I didn't answer that question yet, but I stopped pretending it didn't exist. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic revelation that forced everything into focus. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was alone in our apartment, sitting at the small desk by the window. The city outside moved the way it always did. People rushing, traffic humming, life continuing without noticing me at all. I had just finished reviewing a set of financial documents related to one of her family's ventures, something I'd been asked to take a quick look at. That phrase again. As I worked through the numbers, I realized how deeply embedded I had become in arrangements that weren't truly mine. I was providing oversight, risk mitigation, credibility without authority, responsibility without voice. And suddenly a question surfaced, calm and precise. If this goes wrong, who carries the weight? The answer came immediately. I would. Not because it was fair, but because I was positioned to absorb impact quietly. I had savings, I had stability, I had a temperament that didn't panic. I sat back in my chair and looked around the room. Our shared space, our shared life. And for the first time, I saw it not as a partnership, but as an infrastructure I was maintaining. I thought about the years leading up to that moment, the compromises I'd made, the plans I'd adjusted, the ambitions I'd postponed, not because anyone had forced me, but because the system rewarded my compliance. And then another realization followed, even quieter. No one was going to stop me from doing this to myself. That was the moment things changed, not externally. Internally. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt clarity. I understood that waiting to be seen was a losing strategy. Those roles assigned without consent don't dissolve on their own. And that silence, if left unexamined, becomes a form of self-erasure. I closed the documents, put them neatly into a folder, and instead of emailing my notes, I opened my notebook, the slim black one I always carried. For the first time, I didn't write solutions for others. I wrote questions for myself. What do I want if no one else is in the room? What am I protecting by staying silent? Who benefits most from my remaining predictable? I didn't answer them all that day. I didn't need to. What mattered was that I had stopped assuming the system was neutral. I saw it for what it was, efficient, comfortable for others, and quietly extractive for me. That afternoon, when my wife came home, nothing looked different. We talked about dinner, about schedules, about things that didn't matter. She didn't notice the shift. No one did. Because the most important changes rarely announce themselves. They settle in, they sharpen your perception, they turn silence from reflex into choice. And once that happens, you don't rush, you observe, you prepare, and you stop giving away pieces of yourself without asking why. That was the day something shifted. Not in my marriage, in me. After that afternoon, nothing changed on the surface, and that was intentional. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't withdraw dramatically. I didn't announce new boundaries or demand recognition. I understood instinctively that sudden change would only trigger resistance, questions, reassurance seeking, pressure to return to the version of me everyone was comfortable with. So instead, I stayed quiet. But this time, the silence wasn't automatic. It was deliberate. I listened more carefully than ever. Not just to what was said, but to what was assumed. I noticed how decisions were framed, who was consulted, and who was informed after the fact. I paid attention to the moments when my presence was convenient and when my perspective was irrelevant. And I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine to fill. When something went unresolved, I let it linger. When a plan lacked clarity, I didn't rush to stabilize it. When someone hinted that I would take care of it, I asked neutral questions instead of stepping in. Do you want my input or just execution? Who's ultimately responsible for this? The questions were calm, professional, unemotional. They unsettled people more than any confrontation would have. Not because they were aggressive, but because they disrupted expectations. My wife noticed first, though she couldn't name it. She asked if I was stressed, if work was overwhelming, if something was wrong. I told her the truth without explanation. I'm just being more intentional with my time. She nodded, accepted it. Others interpreted my restraint as fatigue or distraction or quiet acquiescence. They assumed, as they always had, that my silence meant I was still aligned. That misunderstanding worked in my favor, because while they continued operating under old assumptions, I was gathering information. I reviewed documents more closely. I tracked how decisions were made. I noted where financial risk flowed and where authority stopped. I paid attention to how often my resources were leveraged in conversations I wasn't present for. What surprised me most wasn't how much I had been contributing, it was how invisible those contributions had become. People don't guard what they don't acknowledge. And once I saw that, I stopped correcting misconceptions. I let them believe I was passive, that I wasn't paying attention, that I would always adjust. There's a strange power in being underestimated if you choose it rather than suffer it. I wasn't withdrawing out of spite. I wasn't playing a game. I was simply reclaiming authorship over my own attention. And with that came a shift in how I measured myself. I no longer evaluated my worth by how smoothly things ran for others. I measured it by how aligned my actions were with my values. No humiliation, no impulsive decisions, no burning bridges, just clarity. They mistook my quiet for weakness, but it wasn't weakness anymore. It was patience, and patience, when paired with awareness, becomes leverage. What they never noticed was how much attention I paid when no one was watching. They assumed my quiet meant disengagement, that my reduced involvement meant I was drifting, losing interest, becoming smaller. In reality, I was doing the opposite. I was focusing, narrowing my field of vision to what actually mattered. I started documenting things, not obsessively, not emotionally, just accurately. Dates, decisions. Who proposed what? Who approved it? Who benefited? And importantly, whose name was attached when responsibility was implied? The notebook I'd always carried, once filled with reminders and problem-solving sketches, became something else. A record. A map of how influence flowed through the family, how money moved, and how authority was distributed without ever being explicitly stated. I noticed patterns I'd missed before, how my wife's parents spoke about family assets, and how easily my income was included in those conversations without anyone asking. How risks were framed as collective when things went well, but individual when caution was needed. How my stability acted as an unspoken safety net. I paid attention to legal structures, ownership percentages, informal agreements that relied heavily on trust and precedent rather than clarity. I noticed how often I was positioned as a guarantor, financially or emotionally, without formal acknowledgement, and I stopped correcting it. Instead, I began learning, quietly. I refreshed my understanding of marital law in our state. Not because I was planning to leave, at least not consciously, but because information removes fear. I reviewed joint accounts, individual accounts, and obligations I had assumed without documentation. I realized how many things were assumed to be shared that were never formally defined. At work, I had always believed in documentation. Processes fail when they rely on memory and goodwill alone. It struck me how little that principle had been applied to my own life. So I applied it. I consulted professionals, not dramatically, not urgently, just to understand, to clarify, to know where I actually stood rather than where everyone believed I stood. No one noticed. They were too accustomed to my consistency to question it, too comfortable with the idea that I would always be there to smooth things over. And because I didn't announce any of this, there was no resistance. I didn't change my tone. I didn't pull away socially. I still attended dinners, still listened, still nodded. But internally, I was no longer confused. I understood the structure now, the quiet dependencies, the way my predictability had allowed others to take risks they couldn't afford on their own. And with that understanding came a strange calm, not resentment, relief, because for the first time I wasn't guessing where I stood. I knew. And knowing gave me something I hadn't had before, not power over anyone else, but sovereignty over myself. They never noticed the preparation. They never noticed the shift in leverage. They never noticed that the man they thought would always be there was finally choosing when to be. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock, it came as confirmation. By the time I saw it clearly, I had already sensed it for months. Patterns don't lie when you're finally willing to read them without hope getting in the way. The moment itself was quiet, almost mundane. I was reviewing a set of documents late one evening, joint financial statements, informal agreements, email threads that referenced decisions I had supposedly agreed to. I wasn't angry. I wasn't rushed. I was simply thorough. And that's when the shape of it became unmistakable. I saw how my income had been treated as predictable capital, how my creditworthiness lowered the risk for ventures I didn't control, how my presence, my marriage, functioned as reassurance to lenders, partners, even extended family. I wasn't just contributing, I was underwriting. Not officially, not transparently, but effectively. And the most sobering realization followed immediately after. If I were gone, the structure would weaken. Not collapse overnight, but strain. Decisions would slow, risk tolerance would shrink, conversations would change. That's when I understood my true position in the system. I wasn't loved because of my utility. I was loved because of it. That doesn't mean there was no affection. There was. There were shared memories, laughter, and comfort. But affection had become conditional, woven tightly around what I made possible. I closed the folder and sat still for a long time. There was no satisfaction in the discovery, no sense of triumph, just clarity, so clean it felt almost sterile. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't something that could be fixed with better communication or couples counseling. It was structural. I had been framed quietly, efficiently, as the investment that paid dividends simply by remaining stable. And investments aren't consulted, they're managed. I didn't confront my wife, not then, not because I was afraid, but because there was nothing to gain from forcing a conversation before I understood my own boundaries. Instead, I asked myself one question. If nothing changes, who do I become 5 years from now? The answer was immediate and unacceptable. I saw a version of myself further reduced, more invisible, praised for endurance, appreciated for sacrifice, and quietly resentful, even if I never voiced it. That wasn't who I wanted to be, so I made a decision, not the final one, but an important one. I would act from understanding, not emotion. I would move without announcement, and I would leave no ambiguity about where I stood when the time came. This wasn't revenge, it was alignment. The private reveal didn't harden me. It didn't make me cruel. It simply made me honest with myself first. And once that happened, the path forward narrowed. Not because I had fewer options, but because only one of them allowed me to remain intact. Clarity changes the way choices feel. Before, every option had been wrapped in doubt. Am I overreacting? Am I imagining this? Is this just how marriage evolves? Now those questions were gone. What remained was simpler and heavier. I stood at a crossroads that most people never recognize until years later. I could stay. Staying meant continuing to be useful in ways that were never fully acknowledged. It meant accepting that love in this structure was inseparable from leverage, that my value would always be measured in stability, not presence. Or I could leave. Leaving didn't mean disappearing overnight or creating chaos. It meant disentangling myself carefully, deliberately, without drama. It meant reclaiming authorship over my own life at the cost of comfort, familiarity, and the identity I'd built around being dependable. There was also a third option, confrontation. I could lay everything out, demand recognition, force renegotiation of roles, try to rebuild the relationship on new terms. But when I imagined that path honestly, I saw how it would unfold. Surprise, defensiveness, reassurances that changed nothing structurally. Systems don't reform simply because one component becomes self-aware. They protect themselves. That's when I understood something important. The decision wasn't about them. It was about who I was willing to become. I sat with that realization longer than I expected. I didn't rush it. I tested it against my values. No humiliation, no impulsive exits, no actions driven by resentment. If I chose to leave, it would be with precision, with fairness, with a clean conscience. And if I stayed, it would only be if the structure itself changed, not just the language around it. As I weighed those options, one stood apart, not because it was easier, but because it was honest. I chose the irreversible one, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a quiet internal commitment. I would begin separating my life from a system that only valued me as long as I remained predictable. I didn't announce it. I didn't even fully articulate it to myself at first. I simply stopped planning a future that required my silence. Once that decision was made, everything else became procedural. And procedures, unlike emotions, don't argue back. Once the decision settled inside me, my life didn't become louder. It became quieter in a different way. Not because things slowed down, but because I stopped reacting on instinct. For years, I had been the person who filled gaps before anyone noticed they existed. I anticipated problems, I absorbed tension, I smoothed outcomes so others could move forward without friction. That rhythm had defined my days for so long that it felt natural, almost invisible. The moment I stopped doing that, I expected resistance. It never came. No one asked why I wasn't stepping in. No one questioned the absence of my usual reflexes. The system didn't sound an alarm, it simply assumed I would return to my place soon. That assumption gave me time. I started where the consequences were least visible: structure. On paper, our finances were shared. In practice, they were built on overlapping assumptions, responsibilities I carried without authority, risks I absorbed without acknowledgement, stability I provided without protection. I didn't dismantle anything, I clarified it. I separated what could be separated. I documented what had never been written down. I reviewed obligations I had accepted gradually without ever consciously consenting to them. Every step was calm, legal, rational. No dramatic withdrawals, no sudden changes. Just alignment. I spoke to professionals quietly, not in preparation for conflict, but for understanding. I asked questions about exposure, liability, and fairness, about what responsibility actually looked like when two people's paths stopped moving in the same direction. Nothing I did raised suspicion because nothing I did was unreasonable. At home, my behavior shifted just enough to matter. I stopped committing automatically to long-term plans that assumed permanence. I declined obligations that required open-ended sacrifice. I no longer volunteered my flexibility as if it were infinite. I'm not sure yet. Let me think about that. We can revisit it later. Neutral words, calm tone. To them, it looked like a distraction, stress, temporary introspection. No one connected it to intention because they had never considered that I might have one independent of theirs. I also began reclaiming space. Time that had always been available became selective. Emotional energy I used to distribute freely became measured. I listened without absorbing. I supported without surrendering. I returned to parts of myself I had quietly sidelined. Professional relationships I'd allowed to fade. Ambitions I'd postponed because they didn't serve the collective plan. Interests that had felt inconvenient in a life designed around availability. None of it was dramatic. None of it was framed as rebellion. It was simply ownership. What surprised me most was how little resistance I encountered. People rarely push back when they believe you'll eventually fall back into line. And because I hadn't openly contradicted that belief, there was no urgency to stop me. Meanwhile, the foundation they relied on was slowly rebalancing. Risk redistributed, dependencies clarified, assumptions quietly invalidated. By the time anyone sensed that something fundamental had shifted, the old structure would already be unstable. That wasn't cruelty. It was a consequence. Moving in silence isn't about deception, it's about timing. And for the first time in my marriage, I chose mine. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment. They arrived in an imbalance. At first, no one could name what felt wrong. There were no dramatic losses, no visible collapse, just a growing sense of friction where things used to move smoothly. Conversations took longer, decisions stalled, small issues lingered unresolved. The system they were used to, one that quietly relied on my predictability, had begun to encounter resistance, not from confrontation, but from absence. I noticed it before anyone else did. A delayed response where there would have been an immediate solution. A meeting was postponed because Jonathan usually handles that part. A plan revised because a financial buffer was suddenly unclear. Nothing was said directly, but the tone changed. There was confusion disguised as inconvenience. My wife mentioned casually at first that her parents seemed stressed. a few things hadn't gone as smoothly as expected, that there was a lot to manage lately. I listened. I didn't comment. What struck me was how quickly the narrative shifted from confidence to concern without anyone acknowledging the missing piece. They didn't say my name. They didn't say they needed me. They said things like, "It's just a complicated season. There's a lot happening at once. We didn't anticipate this." I recognized those phrases. I had used them myself in the past, usually while quietly fixing the problem underneath them. Now I didn't. And because I didn't, the weight began to redistribute. My wife became more involved in logistics she'd never had to manage. She asked questions she'd never needed to ask before. She started double-checking details she used to assume were covered, not by me but by the system. Her parents grew less decisive. Meetings ended without clear outcomes. Plans that once moved forward on momentum alone now required careful review. The confidence that came from knowing someone else would stabilize the landing was gone. Still, no one confronted me. Instead, they circled closer. My wife asked if I could take a look at something again. Her mother asked for my opinion, framed as curiosity, not necessity. Her father mentioned how much he valued my perspective, how things had felt a bit scattered lately. I heard the subtext clearly. The foundation was shifting, and they wanted it reinforced without acknowledging that it had ever been structural. But I didn't step back in. Not because I wanted them to struggle, but because stepping back in would have meant pretending nothing had changed. And everything had changed. What surprised me most was not their discomfort. It was their confusion. They couldn't understand why the old solutions no longer worked. Why did the reassurance feel thinner? Why had it evaporated? Because from their perspective, I was still there. I hadn't left. I hadn't withdrawn emotionally. I hadn't raised objections or issued ultimatums. I was present, but no longer compensating. That distinction unsettles people more than absence. There were moments when I could see the realization almost forming, like a thought approaching the surface, then retreating. Something is different. Something is missing, but we don't know what. And because no one wanted to examine the structure too closely, they treated the symptoms instead. More meetings, more discussion, more stress. I watched it unfold with a strange mix of detachment and responsibility. Not guilt, responsibility. Because this wasn't a collapse, it was exposure. The consequences were not something I inflicted. They were something that had always been deferred, absorbed quietly by someone who no longer agreed to do so. One evening, my wife sat across from me and said carefully, "It feels like things are harder lately." I nodded, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. She waited as if expecting reassurance, a plan, a solution. I didn't offer one. That silence landed differently than all the silences before it. This one didn't say, "I'll handle it." It said, "I see it." And that made all the difference. The consequences continued to build, not dramatically but persistently. Opportunities were reconsidered, risks were delayed, confidence eroded at the edges. And slowly, unmistakably, the system began to feel the absence of what it had never named. Not my presence, my compliance. By the time they realized something was truly wrong, they were already standing inside the consequences. Not at the beginning of them, not at a point where small adjustments could restore balance. They were in the middle, where effort increases, but control does not. The first sign was urgency. Don't panic yet, just a subtle acceleration in tone. More calls, more messages, more quick check-ins that weren't quick at all, conversations that circled the same issues repeatedly, as if repetition alone might produce clarity. My wife started coming home later, tired in a way I hadn't seen before, not physically, mentally. The kind of fatigue that comes from holding too many variables at once. She talked more, thought out loud, asked questions she didn't expect me to answer, but clearly hoped I would. I don't understand why this is taking so long. It shouldn't be this complicated. They've never struggled with this before. I listened, and for the first time, listening didn't lead to action. Her parents' confidence fractured in stages. First, they blamed timing, then external conditions, then other people. Only at the very end, when none of those explanations held, they began circling the truth they didn't want to touch. Something had changed. And whatever it wasn't external. They invited me into more conversations, asked for my thoughts more explicitly now, not dismissively, not casually, carefully. They praised my insight again, highlighted my steadiness, spoke about how valuable it was to have someone like me involved. It was strange to hear those words at this stage, because they weren't appreciated. They were recovery attempts. They wanted the old equilibrium back, the one where I absorbed uncertainty so they could move confidently, where my presence made risk feel manageable without changing who held control. But that equilibrium no longer existed, not because I was withholding, because I had already stepped out of it internally. There was a moment, quiet, revealing, when my wife asked me directly, "Why does it feel like you're not helping anymore?" She didn't ask it angrily. She asked with confusion, with a trace of fear she hadn't yet named. I took a breath before answering, not to compose myself, but to be precise. "I am helping," I said calmly, "just not in the same way." She didn't know what to do with that, and that's when I understood. It was already too late to fix this by adjustment, because what they needed wasn't help. They needed compliance. They needed me to step back into a role I had already outgrown. Behind the scenes, things began unraveling faster. Projects stalled. Decisions were deferred. People hesitated without realizing why. The absence of a silent stabilizer made every move feel heavier. And in that heaviness, cracks appeared. Blame surfaced, subtle at first, then sharper. Why wasn't this caught earlier? Who approved this? Why did we assume that would work? Those questions used to land on me quietly, where I resolved them before they became visible. Now they stayed in the room. My wife oscillated between frustration and reassurance. She tried to bridge the gap with words. "We can figure this out. It's just a rough phase. You know I appreciate you." But appreciation offered after dependency is exposed doesn't heal the wound. It highlights it. She began to sense that whatever had changed in me wasn't temporary, that this wasn't stress or distraction or a phase I would move through. And that scared her. Not because she feared losing me emotionally, but because she could feel the system shifting without knowing how to stop it. That's the hardest kind of realization. When you understand that the thing you relied on isn't broken, it's choosing not to function the way it used to. They tried to fix it with conversation, with reassurance, with renewed attention. But attention given only when leverage is threatened doesn't rebuild trust. It confirms the structure that caused the fracture in the first place. By the time they sensed that, truly sensed it, the question was no longer, "How do we fix this?" It was, "Can we?" And the honest answer, one none of us said out loud yet, was already clear. No, because you can't repair a system by pretending the foundation was never carrying all the weight. And I was no longer willing to be that foundation. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't look the way people imagine these moments. There was no shouting, no accusations thrown like weapons, no list of grievances was delivered with shaking hands. It happened on a quiet evening in our living room after dinner. The kind of moment where nothing seems important until it suddenly is. My wife sat across from me, her posture careful. Not defensive, not aggressive, just prepared. As if she'd rehearsed the conversation in her head and still wasn't sure how to begin. She asked me calmly, "Are you still in this?" The question landed softly, but it carried weight. I didn't answer right away. Not because I was avoiding it, but because I wanted to respond with accuracy, not emotion. "Yes," I said, "I'm still here." She exhaled, relief flickering briefly across her face. Then she asked the real question, "Then why does it feel like you've already left?" I nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in recognition. "This is the first time," I said, "that I've been fully present without carrying what isn't mine." She frowned slightly, not angry, confused. I didn't rush to explain. I didn't list examples. I didn't reference past moments or reopen old wounds. Instead, I spoke in principles. "For a long time," I said, "my role in this marriage wasn't something we discussed. It was something everyone assumed. I supported, I stabilized, I absorbed risk, and I did it quietly." She listened without interrupting. "But at some point," I continued, "support turned into expectation, and expectation turned into identity. I wasn't being asked anymore. I was being counted on without consent." She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. I could see her searching for a way to disagree without denying reality. I wasn't accusing her. That was important. I made sure my tone reflected that. "I don't think anyone meant to exploit me," I said, "but intention doesn't change impact." Silence settled between us. Not hostile, not tense, just heavy with recognition. She asked if I was saying I felt used. I shook my head. "I'm saying I felt assigned." That word landed differently. Assigned. It didn't accuse her of cruelty. It described a system. She sat back, eyes distant, as if replaying memories with new context. Moments she'd never questioned because they'd worked. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I didn't know you felt that way." I believed her. "That doesn't make you wrong," I said, "but it does mean something has to change." She asked what I wanted. I didn't answer immediately. Because this wasn't a negotiation, it was a boundary. "I want a partnership where my presence matters more than my function," I said, "where support is mutual, not assumed, and where I don't have to disappear for things to run smoothly." She nodded slowly. The movement was automatic, but her eyes reflected uncertainty. She asked quietly, "And if we can't do that?" I held her gaze. "Then we acknowledge that honestly," I said, without pretending it's something else. There were no ultimatums, no demands, just clarity. The conversation ended not with resolution, but with understanding. The kind that doesn't guarantee repair, but makes denial impossible. We went to bed that night without arguing, without reassurance, because sometimes the absence of heat means the truth has finally arrived. I didn't wake up the next morning transformed. There was no sudden lightness, no cinematic sense of freedom. What I felt instead was quieter and far more stable. Alignment. For the first time in years, my inner life matched my outward behavior. I wasn't performing steadiness anymore. I was steady because I wasn't carrying what didn't belong to me. The days that followed the conversation weren't dramatic. They were reflective, deliberate, honest in a way that didn't require constant explanation. My wife and I spoke less, but more precisely. There was no pretending that everything had returned to normal, because normal had been the problem. We were no longer operating on assumptions. Every interaction had weight now, choice behind it. And regardless of where the marriage would ultimately land, something irreversible had already happened. I had reclaimed my identity from the role I'd been living inside. For a long time, I thought being dependable was who I was. My worth lived in how smoothly I could make things run for others. I confused usefulness with love, stability with belonging. Now I understand the difference. Dependability is a trait. Self-erasure is a habit. I stopped confusing the two. Who I am now isn't louder. It isn't harder. It isn't colder. It's clearer. I still value calm. I still choose patience. I still believe in fairness and restraint. But those qualities no longer come at the expense of my presence. I no longer shrink to preserve systems that don't see me fully. I make decisions more slowly now, but they're mine. I speak less, but with intention. I offer support, but only where there is reciprocity. What surprised me most was the absence of bitterness. I had expected anger to arrive once everything was named. It never did, because bitterness usually comes from staying too long in places where you're unseen. Once you stop doing that, there's nothing left to resent. I don't see myself as someone who escaped something terrible. I see myself as someone who stopped negotiating away his own authorship. Whatever comes next, together or apart, I know this much. I won't return to being infrastructure. I won't accept love that depends on my silence. And I won't confuse peace with disappearance ever again. That's who I am now. Not hardened, not heroic, just whole. There's a temptation when a story like this ends to look for a clear winner, to decide who was right, who was wrong, who lost more, and who should have known better. I used to think stories needed that kind of resolution too, something clean, something decisive. But real life rarely offers that. What it offers instead is understanding. And understanding doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives quietly, often long after the damage has already been done. If there's one truth I carry with me now, it's this. Love that depends on your silence is not love. It's convenience. That doesn't mean the people in my life were malicious. Most systems of quiet exploitation aren't built on cruelty. They're built on comfort, on habit, on the unspoken agreement that someone else will always carry what's heavy. For a long time, that someone was me. I believed that being needed was the same as being valued, that endurance was maturity, that not asking for much made me easy to love. What I didn't realize was how slowly that belief hollowed me out. No one wakes up one day and decides to disappear inside a relationship. It happens by degrees, through compromises that feel reasonable, silences that feel polite, roles that feel temporary until they aren't. And the most dangerous part is this: when you're quiet, capable, and consistent, people don't notice what it costs you. They only notice when you stop paying the price. This story isn't a warning against commitment, marriage, or loyalty. It's a reminder that none of those things should require you to become invisible. Support should move in both directions. Sacrifice should be acknowledged, not assumed. And love should recognize your presence, not just your utility. If you see yourself in parts of this story, I don't want you to hear it as a call to confrontation or withdrawal. Sometimes the most powerful change doesn't begin with leaving, it begins with noticing. Noticing where you are always expected to bend. Noticing where your voice has become optional. Noticing whether your silence is chosen or simply taken for granted. And if you're on the other side, if you've ever relied on someone's steadiness without asking what it cost them, this is an invitation to look again, to ask better questions, to listen before absence forces the lesson. I didn't tell this story to be admired. I told it because quiet people are often misunderstood, and because quiet exits leave the deepest echoes. So I'll leave you with one final question, and I genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever realized that you were being valued more for what you provided than for who you were? And if so, what changed when you finally noticed?